Hello! Interpretation, ultimate betrayal, according to composers. And what about pure music? Not dance, no sing, no imitate, no borrow, not opera on the quartet, on the piano, through the piano. Fugues. Masters fugues. Idealized society fugues. Perfect fishes in the tank, constantly, harmoniously, and beautifully gliding along each other. Bach fugues, not those Beethoven fugues that are all colliding fragments of Titanic's leftovers of their ice. It's all so more harmonious in Bach. Is this kind of celestial universe harmony of elements. It's beyond moods, and that's the whole point of interpretation. Of course, the Titanic's icebergs, or iceberg, for me it's the fragmentation of the Beethoven fugues, which are such incredibly intense interpretation-wise elements of fights. And it's the human spirit that prevails over the adversity. That is what makes Beethoven's fugues, I think, so humane or human or both. But Bach. And so C major book 1, C major book 2, the fugue, since he wrote one for each key, in minor and major, or perhaps minor and major, major and minor. The fact is that we grow musically with these fugues through our lives, regardless how many we played, how many we studied, hopefully all, but not always, time after all, repertoire galore, and practicing and generally. But the point is not only in playing them all, the point is that they live with you. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, fa, mi, la, re, sol, la, sol, fa, mi, fa, sol. Oh la la, I was in a subdominant tonality of the 415. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, fa, mi, la, re, sol, la, sol, fa, mi, re, do, si, la, fa, sol, fa, mi, re, sol, fa, mi, re, do. Sol, fa, mi, fa. Well, I have really no shame, do I? I'm better at soprano with head voice. Sol, si, do, re, do, si, mi, do, re, mi, do, si, sol, la, si, do, si, do, re, mi, fa, sa, si, do. Please stay. I'm not going to sing. I just was testing your kindness to. Sorry. As I say, sometimes shame loses me in music. But the idea to solfege them or sing them with or without pitches is so good, because then you really know the fugues by layers. But the point of today's meeting with all of you and each of you at the same time is that I think that interpretation is not just a coating, it's not just a dress, different dress for the same Barbie doll as a model, as a template. I think, I'm sorry for that strange analogy, but strange analogies always people my spontaneous brain. So let me not talk and play, give you example of what I want to say. In book 1, the prelude, as we know, but here we talk of the fugues. Exposition of 4 parts, you feel that these melodic lines inevitably in step motions keep fulfilling the rising with the subject, with the answer. That gives a sense of I think, fulfillment. And so, of course, it could be played staccato and fast in a different mood. Nonsense here. I'm totally disappointed with myself. That makes no sense. It sounds like angry, rushed people put together that don't match. In any case, the dotted rhythm that is in the subject is very nice. After all, normally when you have a dotted 8 and 230 seconds, you have a trill and the 230 seconds of a termination. But here it's not, it's just the intensity that is intended to be even more so at the dot. And then the 30 seconds is a termination. But for invisible trill or unheard trill, in one of the copies of, I think, CPE, he writes it with 2/8 notes, meaning 2/16 notes, which changes a lot with the superposition with the contour subject. Sounds more didactical. His father must have been not very happy, because I think, of what I understand, Bach's father was tough on his kids. Copy this, copy that aria, copy this, practice this, finish that. They must have had more polyphonic chores than only home chores. But the fact is that when they copied to study the piece, they made little customizations, and it does make a difference between, especially interactions with the, it's all about contrary emotions, it's all about common tones. Book C major in 3 voices is 20 years later. Now, did we hear a difference in the development of the style of Bach, being older, and we have the younger Bach and the older Bach? Well, I don't know. To me, Bach was born with Bach, musically speaking, and died as Bach was always. He seems to be a constant stream. You have here and there some things that perhaps are more ornamented, usage of more minor, major. But generally speaking, I think it's the same. Okay, I know he wrote for the Fugue of C major, book 2, mordent with the slash down. But then you hear the G before the G. And if he was to do as he does, the answer... Now the publishers write the slash, but originally he wrote it with an ornament that is only the upper note, mordent, biter, mordant. I know the importance of the subdominant over the dominant in Buxtehude already. In most of his preludes anyway, first identifying the signature of the tonality, the subdominant, 5 of 4. So it could be the same. Of course, you cannot do a mordant with a leading tone. Little sister, go to sleep. And factually, when he has the second voice finish, on the dominant G, he starts with the subject in the third voice. And so, yes, we have in the soprano 5 of 4. So I think that we should be allowed that, after all. Caspar Fischer didn't do it, but Buxtehude did it. And Froberger does it too. I mean, that's okay. In Book 2, or Prelude in Fugue C minor of Book 1, I mean, why not? Obviously, too much French, too much ornamentation, or trying to make it sound gallant. And in the style, I think it's more with emphasis, more with straightforward. I always wondered when he starts an 8th note rest at the beginning of the piece, like in Book 2 actually, are we supposed to explain to the audience pedagogic in our playing, not speaking obviously, that it's not the downbeat on which we start, therefore the silence before the silence of the piece being the rest, then we have the impulse on the beat. But then its accent is too loud, but it gives us the understanding that we started on an upbeat, like here. Or perhaps he would have liked to have it purposely non-defined. All you hear is the stretch of the interval drop in here. Of course, you understand the upbeat, downbeat situation when the second voice enters, because you already have the first one. So why legato and why not? And why not? So the point is, not because I can or I should, or should I because I could think outside of the box and think freely and say legato and running. Since Melzer didn't yet impose the metronome of 1820, since Bach died in 1750, and these are written in 20 and 40 of 1700, we can define by style, genre, imitation of different expressions and the bowings and the phrasing. Now, regardless if we do the unnatural for Baroque bowing, long phrase with many notes in the same bow, or we try to make it sound more like a Baroque dance. So we rise it through our mood. We bring it a character. We dress it up in something when it could be just raw, natural or natural, or actually really objective. Music, pure music, just the lines that suggest nothing but what they are. Leaps of octaves, or just step motion. And so why is the step motion more suggestive of legato, especially on the piano versus another instrument? So the question of, do we dress up in a certain character in order to make an interpretation? The fugues, which are written to be pure music in the sense of contrapoint, polyphony, voice leading. Of course you have rhythm and pulse, but for instance in C sharp major, I know many people don't agree that I slur the leap on the way down. Reminds me of the caprice of second partita's last movement. Or and then he goes and here the leap is a tenth, not even an octave like here. Or just staccato. Or all legato. Bring out only the descending pattern and the expressively thrown, we can call this an escaped. Or because we have just 8th notes and no 16th notes in the subject, I play detached by intuition, or perhaps because I care and love it as I do forever since I know myself. So do we follow better the layers if we play legato all, non-legato all, or some and not all? Make the difference of legato non-legato in the two parts of the three played in the right hand. Sorry. Then at some point I find that we try to do that, I try to do that, and it ends up by sounding sort of forced, like follow me because I'm different and I differentiate myself. What if in the writing, as Richter used to say, don't bring out the subject in every fugue to me. He used to say, smell every second rose. And I would say probably because this way he wanted me to play every other voice that is not the subject or the answer. There is no hierarchy of importance. The subject, the answer, even self-generated in a sort of a cloning exponential expansion from the subject. Then it creates its own contra-subject. Well, it doesn't create it. The composer creates it, obviously. And he does it in 16th notes when the subject and the answer are only 8th notes. composition is always at some point a choice for texture, a choice for dynamic range, a choice for layering, a choice for voicing and singing or imitating the singing. Some of them are written in values that are so large that you cannot not imagine them being vocal fugues, like a 5-voice C sharp minor book 1. And you cannot find any explanation how to do that in book 2 when it's in 12/16. So perhaps the bottom number is so confusing. When it's 4/4 cut time is the 5-voice Fugues with its 115 bars of these. Because the values of the first subject are whole notes and half notes, second thematic material that enters new later, and the running thirds, eighth notes in thirds, but displayed. So you have quarter notes, eighth notes, half notes. So if you start in cut time too fast, sort of brass quartet, quintet. Sound perky like that, but when you arrive and you do then perhaps you play legato, the secondary eighth note theme. Second subject. Now, I personally find that is more meaningful for me. I mean, probably I'm wrong philosophically, but more emotionally, to hear this long, decaying, but almost not totally exhaled, long values theme subject. So when you arrive for the new subject with the eighth notes flowing, the flowing eighth notes, and when you have the new secondary theme, perhaps it's too slow because it's too demonstrative of every detail that appears and combines and superimposes, and it's not so decorative until you get to the eighth notes, or thematic until the second subject with the repeated notes at the suspension moment of tension of the repeated note, when it gets to be dissonant, when you have suspensions or appoggiaturas. So the length of sound, the combination of the resonance and the meaning that you project, inject, and promote in your interpretation is like a credo, a belief, a proclamation of your statement. Well, his obviously, not yours or mine. But for the time being, while playing it, it becomes ours. Or we believe we not generated, but we live it so intensely from the micro detail to the macro construction of the 115 bars that we feel like somehow this musical magic fountain keeps on giving. Whenever in book 2 he wrote in 16th notes without rhythmic patterns. So again 2 and 1 or 2 and 1 and 2 or 6. If you want to bow it, long, short, short, long. And perhaps we should do it by 6, not by 3. Or all legato. Or legato but slower. Undistracted by any syncopation, you follow the passing tones and the step motion. Try to avoid combining two voices in the same hand. It's not. It's really. So could it be legato but faster? Faster and staccato. It feels almost like acupuncture. Always my silly analogies. What bothers me with the staccato is that it could be probably non-legato, because staccato is not just short value, it's a character change. It becomes some kind of ironically funny, when perhaps in the legato it's some kind of melopia, some kind of melodic line of sorrow in minor. Sometimes absolute music doesn't have a dressing code. Dress code? Dressing code? No, dressing is for salads. Dress code, because it seems like it's music for the eyes, it's music for the soul, it's music through the eyes directly in the brain, and you feel like perhaps sometimes no solution of dressing it up corresponds to any kind of conviction, and you feel like in fact this one doesn't work anyway. Sometimes orchestrations don't work really well either, even if they colorize by the timbres. Stokowski did that for symphony orchestras with the Bach organ, D minor, toccata and fugue. It's didactically better to do colorization, but sometimes because the instrument is single color, piano sounds piano, right? It has this kind of homogeneity, which is also part of the combinations of the voices. You can voice them by shadows and lights, chiaroscuro, but colorizing becomes perhaps too didactical. In Book 1, the D major is just an incredible explosion of excitement. Start a fugue on a second beat with a first beat rest in 8:30 seconds, displayed written out decoration. Could have been Ré mi fa sol la fa mi ré si, fa mi fa ré si. It's more complex, but ultimately it enhances the leap of the upper six. After having heard styles of music way beyond Bach, the audacity of a leap of a sixth appears lame to us today. But in fact, especially prepared by 30 seconds, I think it gives more meaning to that leap and more dramatic effect whenever the leaps in the D major of Book 2 are more simple, because there's just fifths, not sixths. Angular, because it doesn't have this 30 seconds almost dramatic effect. Yeah. If not dramatic, perhaps even comic, regardless, but some kind of bravura, bravada. And here it's more austere. And because of the repeated notes, it's tender to imagine that they're repeated non-legato to repeat. But if they're replayed in the resonance, you have the impression to hear something that prolongs the D. Instead of decaying to go to the G, by restating it even halfway, D, you give it a crescendo that the not real D. So if he could have done step motion, which is more natural for keyboard instruments to play connected. But he didn't. And so therefore there is some kind of statement of repeated note, which in singing would be with inevitably with the syllables of the text not heard as repeated. I want to tell you. But in the piano, if it doesn't repeat, it doesn't repeat. And if it repeats, it's too clearly separated or chunked. For which I find it more convincing legato in the repeated notes as well of the. So while it's only in eighth notes, not in half and whole notes, I still think it's more vocal fugue. Well, it's difficult not to, especially in this tempo. If I have to play it faster, of course both are written in well, the other one was C sharp, but the D is also in cut time. So it could be 1, 2, 3, 4. The note after the long note under the decay arrival and create a sense of legato without over holding. Terrible glide. I was betrayed by my pinky. That was because of the cross relation. I so much wanted to insist not to come to the trap of playing that I overstated the voicing, put too much weight and slid out of the key. I'm sorry for that. More cautious the second time then. But here I don't imagine it legato in singing. Stilus fantasticus. The French overture, the dotted rhythm. Majestic. But then again, perhaps it's different for everybody. After all, the character is not set in the pure music, in the music for the voices by itself, the combinations. It's not just music, it's also music that has to be embodied, put alive, brought alive when you play it. You just don't read it silently. Or solfège, you have to say it. So to say played, parlando. And if you do the same faster, fast or slow is not about mood, it's about pace, organization of the beats, of the pulse and the structure, and how many bars beats do you have in the subject in its answer and in the subsequent vision of the exposition. Of course, the instrument matters. I think if it's reasonable to have this length of sound for the dotted eighth notes, like he finishes. Compared to more choral ending. In the 20 years later D major fugue. And he wrote them for harpsichord in both cases. It's not the organ ones transcribed by him on the harpsichord. So the length of sound, the short of sound, is to do with a certain character, gesture, expression, sense, a profound sense of pathos in the Greek, ancient Greek sense of the word, which it is, pathetic. Pathos is to be expressive with conviction, with rhetorical persuasion. And I think that this is more than ever the demonstration of that. It's so charismatic in its expression that it overwhelms almost the whole fugue by those 30 seconds, compared to here where you hear the voices without any distraction. It's more austere. You don't have the fact that I thought outside of the box, just to give an example how he could have done if he did step motion, doesn't mean that I advocate to do that in terms of teaching or performing by me or my students. Rather, think about it as a melodic repeated note. So you can hear in your head DDC if you play DDD as written, but then you give to each D a little bit more of intensity until the leap on the G. Just like the lyrics could be, I want to tell you. So you imagine bow, texts, a voice, breathing, exhaling, wind instruments, orchestra, symphonic, cantata, song, SATB choir, whichever the imagination that you connect to what you think the genre is representative of through the harpsichord, for which Bach wrote diversity of fugues and diversity of preludes. Some more vocal, some others. He didn't define them other than by the gestures and the rhythmic patterns, I must say, more than the obvious decision for the tempo by the bottom part of the meter indication, because after all he writes in 16th, 8th notes, 30 seconds, quarter notes or half notes or even eighth notes, but that doesn't determine the tempo. It's the general texture tracking, the way he travels through the storytelling of the thematic material in the fugue, and in the way he displays it, modulates, and to the dominant with a long stay, and then after the stretto finishes in some kind of a, incredible blossoming of all the voices, in some kind of a, in fact the last chord is technically the climax of the fugue, which starts with one to finish with all. But it's already with all at the end of the exposition, and then it travels through places to do all kinds of things, and then at the end you feel like you end up in this kind of plenitude of the many that were generated by the single cell. That's fascinating. What is fascinating is that 20 years around, he writes E-flat major, for instance, D minor, or D major, and you would think, did he remember what he wrote earlier? Okay, his earlier kids' age, youngest ones from first wife, must have practiced them since there were exercises as well as his students. But did he have his both books to compare, and did he just decide to write another book of Prelude and Fugues, having forgotten the others? He who wrote 40 minutes of new music a week for the cantatas in Leipzig. I mean, it's easy for us to compare, but what about him? For instance, child and I was doing one a week of those Prelude and Fugues, writing from memory in person or in class, and as well as performing on layered, colored, and possibly even in the clefs, open scores that I wrote of them. I remember that in this D minor answer in A minor of book 1, Bach uses the real answer and not the tonal answer. And I remember that I wrote a Bach fugue of this with the tonal answer for my lesson. I must have been so apparently, well, obviously, perhaps not arrogant in the eyes of my teacher. I was just curious. Not that I pretended to to fix Bach, right? The beauty of this exercise was that I learned from my experience, therefore, why he didn't use the tonal answer in this case, where in more cases he uses it. I think it's clear, and so once you play it like it's written, and you play La, Si, you say, oh yes, and then the little bridge to return to D minor for the third voice. It's always nice to have tried, in order to perhaps even more meaningfully love what he wrote. Not only because it's there and we recite it because it's in the score, but to think outside of the box, to think what it could have been in case, to imagine, to enter in the DNA of his thought process, perhaps not even on the level of his shoe, but nevertheless, to try to elevate ourselves to hear how he heard, meaning how he heard inside himself, all these combinations of continuous voice leading, polyphony galore everywhere. Well, anyway. That's where I think that in Book 2 D minor, the fugue, he thought of Book 1's D major with his dramatic fast notes, arpeggiato in this case, but here it's more consecutive tones, a cadenza style. If he had used these rising by thirds using a fourth, and then he did the chromaticism, but the chromaticism with 60th notes. If he had feeling of the subject, so it fits better his chromatic contra subject. With all the suspensions and then the flow of triplets. And when he walks over each other voices with the same notes, I find that so amusing. Perhaps for sure double keyboard harpsichords helped. And on the piano you have to replay it. You cannot hold it and not replay it, or then it doesn't speak. He could have avoided here he even uses a unison passing tone, do, re, mi, the alto, do, re, mi, a double D. That makes me think that perhaps, only perhaps, he has had a copy of Book 1, perhaps not to write like as if in it, which is possible, but rather probably to do to connect to. I assume he forgot what he wrote, and he wanted to remember, and perhaps that drove him to say to himself, why don't I write for the Book 2 another of those driven starts like in Book 1. But here, the E flat major, the difference between Book 1 and 2 is totally obvious. One is playful with 16th notes, the other one is singing with whole notes. That was funny, but wrong, sorry. Bridge every time between voices. One is difficult not to think. First of all, it doesn't say cut time. Second of all, the usage of the whole half notes makes it think more of an SATB, like Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison. Or perhaps then we have to think a little bit differently and think that perhaps one can comprehend and translate or transmit all these voice overwhelming, beautiful melodic lines layered and play it in an allegro tempo. something to do with the free choice of the interpreter, because we have no limitation of the instrument in terms of breathing, bow changing, and therefore perhaps we can play it artificially slow or artificially fast in a certain way. And what would be natural? It would be its original, let's say, genre from which the harpsichord is the vector or the echo of. When you do the D sharp minor, book 1, even in quarter notes, in eighth notes, there is some kind of patrician calm flowing with a lot of almost Renaissance feel to it. You can hear voices or organ with a different stop. Well, himself, he separates the ranges. And then of course he brings them together with a leap of the octave. So far away to oblige to do bar and a half of bridge. Major, minor, minor, major. No. And I know why no. Because I find that if we really want to be honest, we can think that, okay, interpretation is not part of the fugue. The fugue is not a character piece. The fugue remains, despite its notation, rhythmic choice of meter, and suggestion of genre, it remains, and I think forever will, pure music that doesn't need character to justify itself. It's not needing to seduce by being gallant or light or driven and pathetic or dramatic, but perhaps it's just the human nature. We are humans playing those godly, incredible, voiced, layered organizations of a perfection of world as offered to us by people like Da Vinci and Bach, and this kind of translation of an idealization of how things should be, a transcendental vision of the world. Of course, for book 1, he's really into the fun. But in book 2, Caspar Fischer did that already in Ariadne Musica before Bach, the very same subject, almost the same treatment. Again, chorale. large breadth of the flow of the arching of the phrase in groups of 8 half notes. Oh, it's just like overwhelming and difficult to imagine this in cut time as it's notated, but in a cut time that will be rhythmed, pulsed, and instrumental. Okay, perhaps in between. It's difficult, but I'll try to be convincing. Try to convince myself, rather, in this faster tempo and more playful tempo. And perhaps a little less, but still. Closer to the book 1, but is notated in 16th notes. It cannot not be faster. Well, perhaps it can, especially if I don't play it well. Perhaps. It's interesting when I try to convince myself in front of you together about finding a convincing other option technically in terms of phrasing, articulation, tempo, not just the speed, but also incorporating obviously different ornamentation of possible fingerings. Is it perhaps the decades of habit of knowing it? Anyway, I think it is. For some of the fugues, I am biased because I know them for too long now, the way I know them. And I try to convince myself that because they're pure music, I could make an alternative interpretation and try to be convincing. If I can't convince myself, I hardly can convince you, but perhaps I can convince you without to convince myself, though it's probably not easy to reach. In the case of E minor, the only two-voice fugue, basically invention in 2 parts in Book 1. Whenever in Book 2. Rhythm 8/16. You have triplet, which is of course softer. You have the endings. Now we tend to think that in the Baroque times the notation dotted 8/16 was in fact a tripletization. They didn't notate a triplet in terms of notation. They didn't have 3 notes, but only the value. In which case we can imagine that they perhaps aligned. Well, did they really? Or was it because this alignment or unalignment in the section later in the bottom of the page, we have this episode. But then if you do the dotted rhythm, even if you separate it, then you put the triplets. A virtue to it, this contradiction of the two elements in this passage, but it could be also aligned, more flowing, more groovy, perhaps more swinging. But if it is in cut time, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, sorry, 8. Let me try to play it even faster in order to make it really into 2, if it's possible. Well, it's obviously possible. The question is it meaningful? Does it have a rhetorical weight of persuasion? Am I telling something convincingly? Have to be practiced and organized, enlightened touch, especially this breathing, this lightness, compared to the chromaticism of the 8th notes that are embedded in the 16th notes, but without a stem. So it's not really a lament, even if you play it slowly. Augmented second, which uses only for effective moment of expression, but together, well, who knows, but I think still it's not possible to be slow. Oh, how fast is another question, is it? The gesture, the meaning, the leaps, the dynamics of the energy rather than dynamics of loudness or softness. I think a lot of chromaticism is very rich, so if it's played so fast, it's mesmerizing. We don't have time to process as listeners the chromaticism, the answer. In phenomenology, this would be the exact tempo because it allows to comprehend. Compared to here, to have a subject that has triplets, quarter notes, 16th notes, dotted rhythms, suspensions, it's 5 types of rhythm suspension, being the half note, the quarter notes, the 8th note and the 16th notes, and the triplets in between in 8th notes. The triplets bring that sense of lightness compared to the dotted rhythm, which is so voluntary. But then, of course, they could be phrased. No, they could be phrased. They should be phrased. They have to be played either 2 and 1. But that's too heavy on the beat, or the opposite, short, long, Lombardy. Or perhaps it's too short. We should do it by 6. way to lighten up the touch between the return, between the exposition and the return. This one is still possibly in both ways. I think some of the fugues of both books in the same keys corresponding are really made to match somehow, and others he seems to have totally forgotten, and perhaps for the best. So the fugue in the F major from book 1 is so elegant in 3/8, but in bars of 4 it's like a 4/12/8. Crossing of fingers is hands and fingers too. It's so much easier on 2 keyboards. I don't know 2 keyboard pianos yet, if ever. When you have a 6/16, which is so fast in notation, and the 16th note is your main value compared to here, where the 8th note is, I cannot think of it less than that, because to play convincingly slower, you have then to use the 16th notes in groups of 2 and 1. And not that sense of a race between voices. I find it more elegant if I could play it even lighter. Always a downbeat feeling, a rebouncing up, not light, not heavier. Now it becomes fluffy and affected. This is a toccata jig of sorts. Feisty. If it's light touch, it can be funny. Just light-hearted. Literally playful. That's, yeah, compared to... We have the merit to understand what's happening almost in real time. The other tempo didn't allow that. I always wonder to which extent an interpretational choice is to be also pedagogical in its interpretation of the tempo choice and phrasing, so that the listener can hear something that corresponds to what the composer had, of course, imagined, but something that is without a score, still, if not understandable, at least mapped, like as if like if a musical GPS was embedded in the piece, so you can follow what happens to the voices, where they go from the answer to the recapitulation and all. For instance, in F minor, the book 1 is very, in my opinion, even if not written in half notes and whole notes, a very slow fugue. Contrapoint and contrapunct and contrasubject in faster values. I just play casually like that, but those chromaticisms between two voices. It was shocking. And even to today, it's still, at least at best, if not shocking, it's disturbing. And in book 2, I agree, the repeated notes give it that sense of very light-hearted. It would have been perfect in major for the mood. Well, I had to go with the way minor. That doesn't function, so in minor. This time he really does his tonal answer. Of the leading tone. Oh, so many memories of discovering it. I shrink inside my soul as a child that I was when I discovered it. Why do I get, rather, mostly people don't, I guess, get sentimental about such pieces as a fugue that goes through your life as a companion, that looks at you saying, I remain young, look at you. No, I'm sorry. To make sure that the voices in the same hand don't get confused. They're written with different stems in different places, so you could say to bring it out you have to make choices of voicing. Or the opposite. Sorry. And if you don't think that is a solution because it will be too colorized, then you have to be more subtle in the touches. Younger teacher, I was so ultimate, up or down stem. We want to hear the voicing. We don't want to hear the combination of the moving parts in the same hand of under octave stretched voicings. And I think that if nowadays, compared to when I was young, if the composer really wanted to not leave room for any ambiguity, then he, like Bach obviously, should have separated them, not put two parts in the same hand. Of course, you couldn't write many voices, but then the point is that sometimes the listener is forced by the performer to hear something that is unnatural because it's passing a combination of two voices in one, and then it loses all the point of the contrapoint. It becomes a monodic element. In Book 1, F sharp major, it's so charming. I don't imagine another tempo. Perhaps a little more playful, faster, but still with bowings. Yeah, that's the problem. Ré, fa, do, si. Or what about Book 2? He starts on the leading tone. Well, not with the semitone of the termination. Of course, it's in 4/4, but in some of the copies of students was in cut time. Did he suggest? Did they take the liberty? So fast? Why cut time? It was cut time meaning faster? I don't think we can be so sure. 1, 2, 1, 2. Without to subdivide, you can still stretch the beats. He didn't do, but it's feisty. It has this attack at the get-go that is so taking you by surprise, like the and here is directly trill, almost 106, huh? But perhaps it's a mordant more than a trill. And then 5/4, and back to the leading tone. Sorry for this termination semitone, not yet still gallant. But at the get-go, the entrance of the leading tone of the dominant with the tonic, you get to have the tritone superimposed. Compared to the elegant. Perhaps I see elegance and I see provocative and I see, it's all what I hear, I see, I imagine, I in fact, I try to remain open-minded because, for instance, in the two F sharp minors, why the one in 6/4, the other in 4/4, the main movements are in eighth notes in both hands, cases. But in the first one, you have this sense of peace and chromatic slow rising. Because nobody guesses it's not the first beat. But it doesn't matter to him. Of course, it can be played. Of something contemplative is lost. 3, 1. quarters to eighth notes to the group of eighth notes, you feel like it's a rhythmic accelerando, plus the rising on the secondary dominant leading tones, going from the tonic to the dominant. So you have time to digest all these chromaticisms, and 2 by 2 of the beat. This lament contra subject. Totally legato, even if written in faster values, like these are quarter notes. Of course, there is always the element of thinking that the prelude, preparing for the fugue, the tempo of the fugue would be the emanation of the prelude, which might work for some, if not for all, but not always. 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Sol, fa, sol, do, fa, mi, re, mi, do, mi, re, 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 do, do, fa. That was natural sol, fa, mi, fa, si, sol, mi, la, fa, re, sol, mi, do, fa, mi, fa, sol, si, re, sol, do, fa, sol, la, fa, sol, si, fa, sol, si, sol, do, fa, I realize that I'm losing it. Sorry. I should not sing loud voice in front of you. This time my crossing worked, my voicing. There is a level of meditative, I guess, interaction with the piece and how the piece interacts with our hearing, our reading, our absorbing, our understanding, and our rendering. There are so many levels that we have to filter the voices, the passing tones and the real notes, and then the superimposed layers. The complexity is beautiful. It's not just for the purpose of itself. I think it expresses a sense of struggle, a sense of essential, not perhaps struggle in the Beethovenian sense of the fugues, but more about some kind of uplifting of the soul, some kind of necessity for self-betterment. Of course, in the tempo of the book 2, if you play too fast, then they have a secondary subject. Then in that could be that the first page is meditational, and then I think it's a C sharp. What am I doing in minor? Well, perhaps not in E major, but in A major. After all, the relative. There is the chromaticism. it sounds right. That would be B minor book 1, but here in B minor we have the subject, the first subject. Such wealth, such incredible fountain of youth. These preludes and these fugues remain incredibly lively, young and giving and enticing and seductive to the performer, and enticing and exciting, and it's at all levels. Would it be the concentration and the meaningful, or the fun and sort of complex but at the same time incredibly bubbly and full of life, in the real sense of anima in Latin for a soul, soulful, in a way animated. Bach. I wonder if there is a symbolism in the tonalities. When you think about G major, inevitably, psychologically, perhaps by experience of other pieces, but possibly after Bach and not only before, G major seems the tonality of the sunshine, of the no shadow, of the full excitement, some kind of plenitude. And I find that that is so much the case in both books, G major. And the book 2. In 6/8 for book 1, well, it could be also in 3, and in 3/8 for book 2. This I think he might have looked around to remember what he wrote 20 years earlier. And here every time you see 6/8 you think 3/4. Every time you think 3/4 you think 6/8. Is it because it's indicated, hinted, or embedded? Possibly for me everywhere, because I seem to hemiolyze everything I see. I love this pulse dialogue of pulses. That's what it is. Here it's surely short, long, and then here should be a 3/4. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. If not, it's Lombardic. And if it's in 3/4, it's 1, 2, 3, 1. It's less Lombardic, so you don't have that impulse. Short, long, with the 7th rising is so exciting. I swear God, I don't overstate it. It really makes me excited, but I'll try to be more doctoral. Yes, it's a thrilling leap of the 7th, isn't it? Indeed. After all, it is the tonality of the Goldberg. Whoops! Sorry. think I don't want to stop. I want to go for each till the end, but I think you want to hear the different ones after G major, now G minor. And G minor in book 1 and 2 seem to have, because of the different character of the prelude, some kind of similarity in the fugue. As much as the prelude is dreamy, and in book 2 the prelude is so French overture. But in both cases the fugues are extremely rhythmical and decided. The more I rediscover them, the more I plunge in immersion in them. I cannot tell you how much I cannot imagine them in a, perhaps for the sake of being devil's advocate, something meditative rather than decided. Okay, let's not over ornament. It's amazing how proteoformic that piece is. It sounds convincingly beautiful in every way. That's harder because of the repeated notes to be justified slow, perhaps with dynamic range. This cannot work because I think in this case the character is feisty, toccata in the sense of not only touch but the meaningful, driven forward line. For the book 1, I think there was a possibility to think of it. It reminds me almost of F sharp minor, but there is no ties like in F sharp because he's a well, there's a limit to trying, but it's good to try because it's also important to keep an open mind. No matter how old you become and you know for how long the piece is. Emile went overboard. I cannot imagine it not legato. It has something of soothing extension of the horizon line. This radiant entrance, like as a chorale. I mean, for organ. Also 8th notes and 16th notes, also 4/4. Apparently also in the same mood of radiant legato and chromaticism for the contrasubject in major. But you know, I think that I can see a still galant in this. Or the phrasing with the slur on the offbeat. Sometimes I feel like the pure music it is, if I add contra, it's not contrasubject, it's not contradiction. I feel like I'm adding makeup to it when it doesn't need it, if it's just the sounds. Regardless if they're instrumental or vocal, and which of which. That if it's not played legato on the piano, it distracts from its simple beauty and complex beauty by the characterization. As if I want to cutify it. Probably this chromaticism in the secondary voice for the contrasubject is the one that keeps me from becoming too light-hearted. Though chromaticism in major is relatively rare, though it's not rare because it exists obviously, since it's supposed to be neutral, only semitones. But still, no, I don't think we can compare the two, even if they're so alike in the texture and the rhythmic language. Here they couldn't be more different. In book 1. With the tenor, and Richter told me not to only play the entrances but follow the other voices, in this case the tenor throughout. I didn't voice the entrances or bring out when they enter. But you know, I find it pedantic. I mean, not sorry, Richter, but I still think that it needs to have some kind of connection with the new entrance. The idea of the imitation is at the heart of the fugue as a sound, as a being. So you have to hear the imitative, even if slightly deformed by the fact that it's modal tonal, in this case answer. That was silly, right? tritone and the start of the second beat. And the repeated notes, which are not, because I think they're phrased by offbeat, some phrased by two. How can it be? Terrible. It's too superficial. It's too vain. Now the 3/8, 6/8 in the C sharp minor was in the second book in 12/16. Here is in 6/8, but not in 16. So does it mean it's lower than this, which is in continuous 16th notes, and this subject in G sharp minor is continuous 8th notes? Perhaps it should be then phrased or by two. I always heard it, so to say, I always imagined it flowing in transparency like some kind of dirigible in the air. No beats, no bar lines. Just an unveiling of phrases without end. Of course, if you start to cutify it by a phrasing of any bow, and you play fast, it can be pretty. But I think it's more pretty, it's beautiful. In these equal notes, rhythmically, subjects, he had something in mind about studying the legato of the harpsichord, or the overlapping, or the bleeding, or the harmonizing within the passing tones. Perhaps that's too much reading into it. But the same way with this. And if he wanted to rhythmize, God forbids he's not shy, doing this. Sounds like a jig. But I really want to succeed. Find another way to express it than the way I always thought. Or since I know the piece, always being very relative, but still representative of what was in my learning years. A major, book 1. legato, and besides, just because Beethoven 110 is legato, but this. Or perhaps with the ornament. And this. What is the meter? 4/4, but it feels like 1, 2, 3, extension 4. That would be 5, 6, 1. That's what I hear. 2, 3, 4, or if a 1, 6, 4, and not a 4, 4, and 2, 4, because he starts then the answer too early on the third beat instead of the first. There's something that is purposely not symmetrical in the imitation. Obviously, the third voice enters on the downbeat. Or fourth voice, which is not, where the fourth voice would have entered, he has a restatement with the third voice. So he could have done that also for the second voice on the downbeat. There is something so interesting about the extension of the conclusion of the subject that carries it in a way that it's so unstable to start the second voice in the half of the bar, because you don't know it unless you see it, because it's not, if not, it's correct, it's 2, 4, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, then it doesn't matter. But the fact that it is that Haydn does in the C major sonata when he enters, and sometimes in the middle of the bar and not on the downbeat, probably nothing to do. You know, thoughts come in, and reminiscences of something that reminds you of something that projected, or something that was inevitably impossible to have been known since it was before, like this. That Bach would know that Beethoven would write a fugue on ascending fourths melodically by step. Of course, he writes it in a longer values, and Bach writes it in 8th notes, which would mean that it's faster. Well, faster than what? Since Beethoven didn't write it yet. But in 8th notes and the quarter notes and the half notes, there must be something that can tell us. For instance, A minor, Book 1. It has some kind of voluntary interruption of the minor 9th leap down. I mean, that is audacious. Even today, I assume, perhaps not, obviously, but still, immersing. That's what he does almost in a mirror in the book 2, 20 years later. And in book 1 he did. Now he starts to imitate himself. energy in the bridges, especially in syncopation. Unbelievable. This I don't even want to try, though I should, since the point of it is to try alternative interpretations. This cannot be legato, but this could be. The beginning of this first variation of the series variations by Mendelssohn. That's Mendelssohn writing neoclassical for his time, which was then not neoclassical, but neo-baroque, perhaps. I don't think they called it baroque yet. It doesn't matter what they called it. The interesting thing about it is that this chorale with decorations and melodic line and secondary voice and imitation that he does on the organ for the choral preludes, when he adapts it on the keyboard for the harpsichord, is so incredibly rich. In B-flat major, I find that both are just delightful. I don't even know if he was thinking I was still galant or wanted his students to sing and play and dance at the same time, because in book 1, you rise for B, for C, and for D into E. And if you want to do it faster, lighter touch and very transparent for the 16th notes, and not too insisting on it. Not ornamented, but perhaps light touch. And then in book 2 he makes it even. And then the lament in major. Perhaps he wanted something more. With shorter subphrasing. When they're in faster values, they can be in slower tempi, but then they become just very gentle. But if they're in slow values and you think they're slow tempo because of the genre character of a motet or something, or some kind of organ instrument with longer values for the decay, in cut time or in half times of half notes times, like B-flat minors, I think it's difficult to play them opposite, because then they seem to be impatient. Also because of the drama in the subject of the B-flat minor of Book 1, the leap of the minor ninth. That pregnant rest that brings it so above the octave. And the answer, being tonal, goes to the 10th. Now a 10th is really a big leap. I know that in the second partita earlier. Well, I'm doing it now by tonal. He wouldn't write by tonal, but that's not the point. The 10th is a rare interval for him, really is. Let's see if it was fast. The richer car, old-fashioned for Bach's time already, style genre, even if in cut time, but a stretch cut time. It shouldn't be so easy to do these leaps of the minor ninth and the minor 10th. And the chromatic sings is arising just like an F sharp minor. Here in the bridge. That because of the 5 voices, it's hard to go fast because you need to have the time to listening to them, to filter them, how they macerate within each other's layers. In Book 2, it's, I think, more like the A minor, decided one, decisive. In the character, he have 2 parts of the subject, one with the interruption and then second half with the rush. Finally the dominant. Has to be the driven forward one. I don't think there is a way that it can be not. And as much as the B major of Book 2 is sort of a chorale that is SATB choir, written in half notes on cut time, it's almost combinable with the subject of 20 years earlier B major in 8th notes. That's silly. It's not the point. If he really meant it, woohoo! What a generosity for his students, for his children, for whoever studies, even after him, obviously, to write such a beautiful complexity, such a clarity in the complexity, such a flow in the elements. Each fugue has a personality, even if you do different characterizations, obviously, more or less successful in interpretation. And avoiding the cross voicing becoming single voice. That's perhaps the tempo helps. If it's faster, it can be only if it's one voice is detached. You know what? It's possible. I have to study that. Possible. But I'm not convinced. When he uses long values and then very short values between half and whole notes and eighth notes, well, he doesn't have 16ths in this one, but you feel like there is a sense of grandness with the long values, which allow to play eighth notes on the top, like he did in Book 1, C sharp minor, or he does in the organ centaury. A faster characteristic, the secondary or second or third subject that fits within the long values of the chorale whole half notes in this case. Whenever here they're only eighth notes. And everything is leapless, almost every part seems to be doing step motion. To be more thoughtful. Which leads us to the crown jewel, the last one, B minor. The longest subject, sub-phrased or legato, off-beat phrased, diminished sevenths, chromaticisms, tortured but finally arrived to the dominant from which it started. In a way, he went full circle. And the same descending arpeggio, F, D, B, Fa, Re, Si, he uses 20 years later in Book 2. In a much lighter manner, I think 3/8, playful. Trills fall everywhere in the contra subjects, bringing such brilliance, a sense of excitement in the fire in the tips of the fingers whenever the secondary voice, the contra subject in the answer. In this immensely mysterious dissonance without resolutions, almost mysteriously weird, almost as if he doesn't want to resolve the dissonances anymore, as if it's not tensions for no releases. It's not atonal, but it gives that illusion of being everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Such a long subject, plus the bridge to return for the fourth voice. Crossings, leaps, leading tones to thirds. Such a light three voice episode. It's so tender and intense, you feel like it shouldn't be the end of the book. Well, of course, there was another one, right? 20 years later. Two different treatments of the same subject, which he hasn't done in the other 23 or 46. And here, if it was played with the same mood, but 3/8, it's jiggish, and you can see the 2 against 2 and 1 and 3, 2 and 3, 3 and 2, short long, or long short, or the opposite. For sure, I think the B minor of Book 2 is really playful. Whenever the B minor of Book 1, which is so long, nothing but because of the length of subject. The inevitable Picardy third, but why does it end? At least in Book 2 he finishes without Picardy. Mademoiselle Boulanger's score was the Bärenreiter. The pages almost break that I inherited from her, on which I recorded the CD when I was young. These Bärenreiters remind me of some of the notes that I forgot since I learned them as a child from memory. Upside down, downside up. Thank you so much for sharing this trip in possible various interpretations or characterizations of purest music possible, of polyphony, polypulsy, polyrhythmy, polycreativity of Bach's fugues, 48 of them, 20 years apart. What a treasure cove. Thank you, Johann. Thank you, Master Bach. Tree that keeps on giving.